Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlik here. So although I didn't assign it in class, I wanted us to talk about another chapter in Sidney Tarrow's Power in Movement book, because I think it's worth helping set up some of the discussions and some of the readings we'll have throughout the semester. So when we think about protests and social movements, it's tempting to focus on individual movements kind of in isolation, just the protest or the social movement itself. We might study the civil rights movement, which we'll spend some time on, anti-war movements, which we'll spend some time on, even Black Lives Matter movement as separate cases. But one of the most important insights from Sidney Tarrow's Power in Movement is that protests rarely happen in isolation. Instead, contention tends to come in waves. So there are periods in political history when protest activity, protests themselves suddenly intensify. New movements emerge rapidly, participation expands, tactics spread, and political conflict feels kind of everywhere at once. Then, just as suddenly, things calm down, movements fade, participation drops, and politics appears more orderly again. You may have encountered this or noticed this in your own lives, or just when you're thinking about movements that have occurred during your lives, how they seemingly appeared and then went away or vanished. So, chapter 10, again, I didn't assign it for students to read, but worth talking about. Chapter 10 introduces the concept Tarrow uses to explain this pattern, what he calls cycles of contention. A cycle of contention is a period of heightened political conflict across a society. It involves multiple groups, multiple issues, and multiple forms of contentious action. Rather than a single movement pushing a single demand, cycles are moments when contention becomes contagious. Protests spread from one group to another, tactics are borrowed and adopted from another, and the political system becomes unusually fluid and unstable. So these cycles are not accidents, and they are not simply a result of widespread anger. They emerge when changes in the political environment. Sorry, my dog's digging at the carpet. Where were we? So they emerge when changes in the political environment create openings for collective action. Tarrow emphasizes that cycles of contention begin with shifts in political opportunities, which we talked about in our previous video. These might include divisions among elites, declining state legitimacy, economic crises, electoral realignments, or policy failures. But it's important to understand that opportunities alone do not produce protest. Political opportunities must be perceived and acted upon. Typically, a cycle begins when a relatively small group of actors takes a risk. They protest, strike, occupy, or mobilize in some visible way. If this action appears successful or at least survivable, it sends a powerful signal to others. It suggests that protest is possible, that repression may be limited, and that collective action might produce the hoped upon results. So at that point, contention begins to spread. One of the most defining features of cycles of contention is diffusion. Protest tactics Slogans and organizational forms move quickly across groups and issues. People observe others are doing and imitate it. This is why protests, Tarrow argues, this is why protests during a cycle often look similar, even when they involve different causes. So Tarrow calls these shared forms of protest modular repertoires. Marches, sit-ins, occupations, strikes, and boycotts are not reinvented each time. They are learned, borrowed, and adopted. Once a tactic proves effective, or at least visible, it becomes available to others. As contention diffuses, participation expands. Early participants in a cycle tend to be highly committed activists with strong ideological motivations. But as the cycle grows, new groups enter. Participation becomes easier and less risky. Costs decline, and people who might normally not protest begin to join the movement. This expansion often leads to broad coalitions. Movements that began around specific issues start to intersect. Environmental activists, labor groups, students, radical justice organizations, and political parties may find themselves operating in the same protest environment. Claims broaden, alliances form, and protest becomes a generalized feature of political life. Importantly, cycles of contention are interactive. They do not involve only challengers. States, elites, and institutions respond. And these responses shape the trajectory of the cycle. That's my dogs in the background. They say hi. Hi, Maze. Hi, Mia. So, governments may repress protests through policing, arrests, or surveillance. They may also offer concessions, reforms, or symbolic gestures. Sometimes they do both at once. These responses can either dampen contention or intensify it. So repression does not always end protests. In some cases, it radicalizes participants, strengthens group identity, and attracts new supporters. Concessions, meanwhile, can split movements by satisfying moderates while alienating more radicalized activists. Tarrow emphasizes that states often respond not to individual movements, but to overall climate of contention. When protest is widespread, governments may pursue reforms that would otherwise resist, simply to restore stability. As cycles develop, they often become more polarized. Interaction between protesters and authority hardens identities. Boundaries sharpen. Movements may radicalize, not because they intend to, but because repeated confrontation pushes them in that direction. Polarization is often a product of interaction, not ideology, Tarrow argues. Eventually, however, all cycles decline. No period of heightened contention lasts forever. Cycles can end in several ways. Repression may become more effective or more severe. Activists may burn out, become exhausted, or they may exhaust their resources. Coalitions may fracture as groups pursue different goals. Protests may be absorbed into institutional channels like elections, courts, or policymaking. Sometimes movements achieve partial victories that reduce the urgency of polarization. Crucially, decline does not mean failure. One of the most important arguments in chapter 10 is that cycles of contention often produce indirect and lasting effects, even when movements fail to achieve their stated goals. They leave behind new organizations, new political identities, expanded norms of participation, and changes in how citizens understand their role in politics. Cycles reshape political culture. They alter expectations about what is possible. They expand who feels entitled to participate and how participation is expressed. Even when protest fades, these changes remain. So this helps explain why political systems evolve over time without constant mobilization. Periods of intense contention act as engines of change. They disrupt existing arrangements, force institutions to adapt, and leave behind these new political landscapes. So the key takeaway from chapter 10 is that protest is not an abnormal disruption of politics. It is instead, sorry, my dog is here. Instead, it is a reoccurring feature of political development. Cycles of contention may help explain why politics sometimes feels orderly and routine, and other times chaotic and unstable. Understanding cycles of contention allows us to move beyond simplistic questions like, do protests work? Instead, it encourages us to ask deeper questions about timing, interaction, diffusion, and long-lasting political change. If Chapter 1 of Power and Movement explains what social movements are, Chapter 10 explains how they matter, and maybe even why they matter. Not just in isolated moments, but across time, institutions, and political change. Thank you.